saying is governments now have to take a decision and say that no meat now. Why don't governments say no drugs, no cocaine? Some governments will at some point say no smoking, hopefully. So why don't they just say no meat? Or not no meat, I'm saying, no meat export. You want to eat meat, produce it yourself. You'll find half of the world can't produce it.
Yeah, briefly, just to follow up on what, my name is Melanie St. James. I'm here from Empowerment Works. We're based in California. We're a global sustainability think tank in action. And the first thing I'm hearing is that there's a lack of evidence-based policy making. And so, Madam Gandhi, from your experience, long experience in government in India, what do you feel would enable, what mechanisms could on a national level, like you said, so we can take action, each country do what they can. What have you seen to be effective? And also in regards to what is culturally relevant and normal, just wanted to call attention to Dr. Mienge's presentation yesterday about the proteins that have been traditionally in the African diet, and actually that the meat consumption is more of a neo-colonial consumer-based strategy and marketing from globalization, and the evidence of that historically, and how that has really become more of a market trend rather than our own culture here, or the culture here.
So the question is, what should governments do? Is that the question?
How can evidence become part of the policy-making framework?
The first thing is to, I'll tell you a story. I don't know whether it should be on television, but it's a correct story. When I was 32, I was Minister for Environment, and I was sent off to fight to work the Montreal Protocol because India was holding up the entire agreement. So before I left, I asked the Prime Minister, what should I say? And he said, I don't care, say anything. And so I actually studied, and we managed to get the protocol through. But that were my specific directions. I don't care, do what you like. So the first thing is perhaps to bring these up in all parliaments. Let people bring up methane for debate. Let everybody realize the seriousness of the situation. And then let governments sit together and work at it in their own way. If some people want to do coal first, let them do coal. If some people want to stop meat export, as India should. If some people want to reduce leather, then put moratoria on, for instance, no leather to be worn by children on school shoes. No leather to be worn here or there, or whatever, in large groupings. Now those things can be adjudicated executively. For instance, the Supreme Court in America has ruled that vegetables have to be given to children in schools. Now, after the Supreme Court has made its decision about giving vegetables to children in schools, the American government has allowed pizzas to be called vegetables. So, you have to make up your mind. But things can be done by governments. And the rest is, of course, if one person stops eating meat, that's 15,000 less animals being born. So if each one says, okay, I'm not stopping it from today, then you make a huge difference, huge. If you instead say, oh no, I won't eat cattle from today, but I'll eat chickens, then you are creating a bigger crisis, because for every bit of chicken, you have to have 10 more chickens than you have to have a cow. And if one cow releases 600 liters of methane, a chicken releases 250. So you actually at the same crisis. So you have to, each person has to now make up their mind for themselves. But yes, governments, I don't know how governments can do it. I know how the Indian government can do it. Bring it into parliament, let it be talked through, let decisions be made executively, and they will be followed.
It seems very strange, but that a whole conference on global warming actually ends up with the governments talking about money. But that seems what they're talking about. They're not really talking about saving our planet, they're talking about money. And it leads you to begin, especially with all the things that have been happening with the world of money, and you begin to realize money is really a scam, isn't it? It's just a way of controlling the resources of the world.
No, but they're talking about money because there's nothing else to talk about. If I say that I'm going to pollute as much as you pollute, and you pay me for not polluting, then the answer is money. But how do you stop? See, the people giving the money, the United States was giving a polluter fund, right? Now I know in India that you did the stupidest things and then you claimed that money. So you didn't actually make any difference. Suppose I was running a shop and I decided instead of giving plastic bags out, I gave paper bags out. Then I would get money from the polluters fund. Suppose I grew 15 trees in my backyard, I could then claim money from the polluters fund. So if you're going to throw money about like that, then the talk will always be about money because there's never enough. But there's no way in which the people taking the money are using it sensibly. And there's no way that the people giving the money can or even should give it. Alright, I made a mistake. I polluted the planet. Why should I give you money now not to pollute it? You do it yourself because in any case we're going to die. Maybe because of my mistake, but you're dying just as much.
The thing that also worries me about money is it's a means of certain very few individuals controlling the world. And so
we never get that far because there's never enough money. So how do they control the world?
They just create more.
No, America gives the money, but they give it to the Indian government, for instance. The Indian government disperses it like a normal lunatic would, which means straight into the dustbin. You know, in terms of paper bag replacements or other rubbish. So nobody controls anybody, it's just money for jam. You know, you just throw it away.
Do you foresee us ever living in a world without money? Because I think that's the solution. Because then it changes the power.
I would be hard put to get up every morning and say, okay, how much does this cost that I can exchange for an egg or not? I'd have to reevaluate everything I owned. And it would open up huge exploitation of mines. It would lead to more wood cutting. Because then you're exchanging. The barter system in this day and age, with our mentality, would destroy the world in 3.5 minutes flat.
Why would it have to be barter at all? Why do you have to evaluate everything? Why don't we just put in because we want to? Because we just want to contribute something to the planet?
Because when we were doing that, there were probably 1 million people on the planet. And now there are 7 billion. And I can't see 7 billion people actually negotiating a lack of tender, legal tender.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions from Madame Gandhi?
We should go to Daniel now. He probably has far more sensible things to say.
I just want to ask my name is Jean. We run a small farm in Canada. And one of the problems is we sell 2 tomatoes, and that costs people $1. And they go, $1 for 2 tomatoes? I can go get a hamburger at McDonald's or another place for $1. And this is caused by subsidies. This problem of...
I want to grow and export peas. I have to buy land, put in the pea seeds, harvest them, can them, send them abroad, all at my own expense. But if I want to export meat, I grow the meat. When I say grow the meat, the goat can graze free on government land, denuding all the hills and villages of their rightful pastures. It's free. I then take it to a government slaughterhouse where it costs me 1 rupee, that's about 1 cent or 2 cents, to get each goat killed and cleaned and packed for me. And I then export it, and for every meat goat that I export, I get an incentive of double of what it cost me. And if I want to set up a slaughterhouse myself, I get a free loan from the, not loan, I get a free grant from the government of 20 million rupees. And I can set it up and I don't have to repay the loan. So that is the kind of incentive I have for creating meat and for feeding the rest of the world. So as a result, I have no forests left. I have no pastures left. Oh, absolutely. There's a demand for it. But there's a demand for it because I've created it. I'm giving to them free. I give you a 1 kilo of meat at 20 cents. So obviously there will be a demand for a 20-cent meat. And I can give it to you at 20 cents because the pasture has come free, the forest has come free, people's water has come free. I have created only death and devastation in the villages because they have no plants left, they have no water left because of the goats. We have whole, mountain ranges like the Aravalis, which have not got one plant on them left anymore. My sewage systems are blocked up with blood. Everything, and that's why I can sell meat for 20 cents a kilo, which is what I'm doing. That is why I'm feeding the whole of the Middle East. So if I remove those subsidies and said, okay, you want to grow goats, you tether those goats, you feed them on food that you've grown yourself. You will use your own slaughterhouse and you will pay this much money for the slaughterhouse. You will look after your own sewage boy. You will do everything that I do as a vegetarian to grow food. And when you send it abroad, I'm not giving you an incentive to export it, you export it and whatever money you get, good for you. Then my meat instead of 20 cents will cost $200. And then there will be no demand for it, I assure you.
Thank you, Madam Gandhi. Our next speaker, Dr. Daniel Maingi, is a molecular biologist with a passion for conservation of both biodiversity and ecosystems. He is also a devoted vegan. Daniel has served in both public and private research organizations in Kenya and in the United States. Dr. Maingi works with numerous organizations to preserve natural habitats, to feed the hungry, and to help small farmers thrive through sustainable agricultural practices. We will take your questions after a few comments from Dr. Daniel Maingi.
Thank you, members of the press. I think I'd like to twist most of the discussion this afternoon to the questions of Africa and its place in the climate change debate. I think from many of the scientific journals and papers that you read, the evidence actually shows that the African person, whether here or in diaspora, is more affected by lifestyle diseases. You go to the US and you find the black American, the African American people are the ones with the highest rates of cancers, heart attacks, and also diabetes. And you come to Kenya, you come to Nigeria, or even South Africa, and as soon as you introduce meat, you start getting a lot of problems, and then the health cost goes up in the hospitals and all that, simply because for many years, Africans never used to eat much meat as we're being forced to eat right now. Most of the diet was based on protein coming from plant sources. And I can tell you the case of Ethiopia, which has this particular plant. It's in the millet wheat family. It's called teff. It has the highest amount of protein in it. And if you make what they call the injera and put all your other greens on it, you won't need any other protein from anywhere else. Now that we are in the stage of globalization and we need McDonald's, we need Kentucky Fried Chicken to come in so that we feel we have reached, then it has become very common that as soon as our income goes up a little, then it's a privilege to go and eat meat. And then you eat meat not once a week, but almost every day. And now you're at the stage where you're eating meat for breakfast, meat for lunch, and meat for dinner. Unfortunately, and this is my specialty, that's my area of training, your genetics don't allow that kind of situation. Your heart gets clogged and you're falling around like flies. And so what I'm saying is that really we in Africa, we should resist from the persuasions on the billboards that, oh, this slab of dripping meat looks so good and yummy. We should really get away from that and stay on what we used to do, and that is eat a variety of many things, and then I know there are so many negotiations, but there are others that are also related, where we have come to a point where U.S. subsidies for their farmers in the USA are producing so much grain for their cattle. But then once their cattle are fed, they have still so much surplus and they're exporting it to Africa. And in Africa, we end up eating what the animals were supposed to be eating. In the GMO meat, GMO corn, that's what is being exported to Africa. Our World Food Program are exporting all that stuff. And why? Because we, back in the 70s and 60s, there was a revolution, the agricultural revolution, which is called the Green Revolution. And now we have come back around to the stage where we have a second green revolution that is being pushed by very prominent people. What is called the new revolution for a green, the new green revolution for Africa. Where again, and this is very true, we burn up a lot of the savannas, like our friend from the Preservation Foundation is saying. We burn up a lot of forests in order to be able to put plantations for corn and soya, and we feed back into the market for cheap grain that will feed the animals. But in the surplus, we feed the human beings. So let me call you back to the point. Climate change is really being fueled by our lifestyle changes. And if we can cut back, like we have always been, on eating meat, then we can begin to make impacts, not in 50 years, but within the next 10 years.
Within the next 10 months, depending on how many people leave it.
So can we take questions for Dr. Wayne?
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Judy Sawley from SABC TV. I've been very interested in the position of meat and health for a long time because to some extent it seems almost poetic justice that what we do to animals should result in making us suffer so much. And yet in Africa there's this statement, meat is meat and a man must eat, and that's become synonymous. It's considered male, especially I think now amongst the black males, I think particularly, but I think even amongst the South African males, it's meat is meat and a man must eat. In actual fact, they have found out that, I think, that with the amount of female hormones that you get in your meat, exactly the opposite actually occurs. Could you comment further on that? And also, one other thing is that could you comment also on the amount of toxins that are in battery farm meat, please, and what effect it might have on our immune systems?
Thank you so much. I'm told there's a very popular song in South Africa that is talking about women who are very well endowed in their behinds.
My mom is genetic. Say it.
Yes, and unfortunately, I don't know why, but really we should address the question of what we are eating, what it's doing to ourselves, and stop confusing where our attractions are going. It can be good for a short time, but it's very bad for your heart. And talking about what's happening, whether it's the fast food that we're eating, or the chicken, or the meat, I began by talking about the African DNA, the African gene, being so responsive to input, and especially of the proteins that we're putting in. But it has a lot more to do with the hormones that are in the whole food system, which is certainly unnatural for the African gene.
Hello and good morning. Welcome to the Environmental News Network. You're speaking to Jason Saul, filming from the beautiful Monkey Valley Resort in Cape Town. It's July 8th, and today is the day that I'm going to tell you the basics of climate change. The reason that I'm telling the basics of climate change is based on our release that we did earlier this week on the 1.5 degree targets that were set by COP21 and the responses that we got to them. Although we got some really good responses from people that completely supported and understood what we were talking about, it seems to me that the large majority of people are in an absolute loss as to what climate change or global warming or man-made climate change actually is. And they seem to believe that it's somehow a conspiracy theory that needs to be kind of shouted at or put down or, you know, basically ostracized from the brains of all society. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you the basic mechanics of climate change. And it's important that you understand this, because once you're armed with the basic mechanics of climate change, you can for yourself actually see and understand why it is that we state this position in terms of climate change and the effects thereof. So in order to do this, we've got to stand on solid ground. We've got to have a basis upon which something is not refutable. You cannot come up with some counter-argument. You cannot say, no, that never happened. We're going to refer back to the geologic record. So we know, based on what's called banded iron, we know the degree to which oxygen started to emerge inside of our atmosphere. Prior to it emerging, there was no oxygen, and thus there was also no life. Because without oxygen, there is no life. And we know that in the origins of this planet, that the chemical atmosphere was too complex and too wild and had very, very, very little oxygen that wasn't formed out of basic natural processes. But due to the banded iron, we're actually able to see the emergence of oxygen over a sedimentary rock record. And so from this, we can ascertain that roughly 2.5 to 2.7 billion years ago, oxygen started to emerge. To more and more and more, we basically started to see the increase in oxygen as time went on. And this also corresponds with the fossil record of the emergence of microbial life. So what you're actually seeing there is, instead of seeing something, okay, in terms of iron needs oxygen in order to form kind of rust lines on it. So based on the increasing volume of rust lines on banded iron, you can see the greater increase in oxygen that was available in the atmosphere. This is basic geological fact. It is not disputable. It's not like saying, hey, there are aliens or there are no aliens. It is a geological reality. We also know, based on the fossil record, that there was what we call a blue-green algae, but it actually is broken down to a whole lot of phosphates and microbes and different tiny, minuscule, microscopic organisms in the sea that learned how to photosynthesize. And as we already know, photosynthesis is the uptake of carbon dioxide and the release of oxygen, and they use the carbon to construct their bodies, shells, and basically their existence is based around carbon, as is ours. We are what is called a carbon-based life form. In fact, all living things on this planet are carbon-based life forms. Our bodies are comprised purely of carbon, complex carbon, but carbon. And it's for this reason that slow process of attaching carbon to their body and releasing the oxygen started to reflect on the banded iron record. There was a gradual increase of oxygen that was available in the atmosphere. Again, this is a quantifiable scientific fact. It is not a disputable fact. The timing that it took place, maybe 2.5, maybe 2.8 billion, is irrelevant. The fact is that it most certainly occurred. After this, we're going to jump almost 2 billion years, 2.2 billion years, to what we call the Carboniferous period. The Carboniferous period was very interesting in terms of the formation of the planet and the alteration of the atmospheric chemistry of the planet. The Carboniferous period was kind of, brought into existence by the appearance of massive, massive trees, massive, massive swamplands, and the world was completely occupied by living tree species. Tree species have been on this planet far, far longer than any complex living organism, like a human, like animals, like any other species. Older than dinosaurs, they have been around for eons. In fact, in this case, they've been around for roughly 250 million years, is the first emergence of what we call the Carboniferous period. Now, it's important this, because as we already know, and you learned this in basics in terms of school and primary school, that all trees and all kind of plant life operate on a basis of photosynthesis. Now, I'm not going to debate around the evolution from microbes in the water to tree life, but it is kind of obvious that they both utilize the same method of harvesting energy and building their bodies while releasing oxygen. And what this caused was an explosion of oxygen around the atmosphere. The content of oxygen in the atmosphere was far greater than what the content of the atmosphere is now, which is roughly 21%. It's theorized to be roughly 35%. But that content of atmosphere is actually interesting because it brought about a later period which came to be known as the Jurassic period. But to come back to the Carboniferous period, what's important about the Carboniferous period is this, is that as forests died, new riverways came through and wiped out entire forests, or new ice kind of overwhelmed a certain area, and that area remained frozen, a lot of this carbon was trapped underground. And this carbon, or any carbon, which is the trees in this case, so basic piece of wood made up of carbon, but because it had no contact with oxygen, because it was trapped under the ground, the rotting process never took place. The process in which something rots, the first and most important requirement in order for it to rot is contact with oxygen. And this is a well-known fact. If you remove oxygen out of anything, including your chips that you eat on a daily basis or whatever, that you're not going to have any rotting. It's a method of preservation. And likewise, the moment that these trees and these swamps were covered and they lost contact with oxygen, they remained that way until they got covered further with further and additional and more layers of sediment. They were buried deeper and deeper and deeper under the ground. And the pressure and the heat from the earth is what converted these to coal, which is this. It's basic carbon. This is pure carbon. And it derives from the pressing of this without contact with the atmosphere. Now in my case, I burnt my coal, okay? So that's how I got my coal. But in the planet's case, it occurred by trapping tree species, swamp species below the ground, and that was the formation of coal. But the important tying factor here is not how coal was formed. It's not important how coal was formed. What is important is to understand that the atmosphere was once a place that was unable to support life, was unable. And due to the emergence of tree species and microbial species that converted that atmosphere into their bodies, they were able to release oxygen, which in turn was able to support life. So understand, bad atmosphere to good atmosphere on the basis of photosynthesis of a well-documented, well-known, irrefutable piece of science. Now later, as a result of the Carboniferous period, it brought along many different kind of alterations. There was a marine period, but the most popular period that everybody knows about, mainly due to Jurassic Park, is called the Jurassic period. The Jurassic period was characterized by having these vast, kind of Tyrannosaurus rex and brontosaurs and various different massive dinosaurs. Now, the interesting thing, and the only reason that there's two reasons why I'm going to bring this up, but the one reason that I'm going to bring it up is this, is that what is known about dinosaurs is that their huge lung capacities were only able to sustain such a big creature because the content of oxygen in the atmosphere was so high, it was able to sustain much bigger creatures. Creatures became bigger, and hence you have dinosaurs. The second thing is I'm going to clear up a little misconception. Everyone believes that oil is derived from the Jurassic period, the rotting carcasses of big brontosaurs, and to a certain extent they're right. The Jurassic period did create some oil. As marine species died back, and as massive landslides or mudslides wiped out big dinosaurs, it's true. A portion of the oil that we find in the world today is from the rotting carcasses of dinosaurs. But this was only made popular by a company called Penn Oil, which is now subsequently gone. They made the famous claim that our oil comes from the body of dinosaurs, and they actually were so famous they branded their logo, Penn Oil, with a picture of a brontosaur on it. And for some reason that kind of stuck with the general public. Most of the public believed that, but the reality is that couldn't be further from the truth. A tiny fraction of the amount of oil that we get is from living bodies. The majority that we got was from those microbes, that algae, that as they died, they settled to the bottom of the sea and they were unable to rot. And they eventually got covered up and covered up and covered up, and the pressure and their rotting bodies is what caused the oil. And this is important because you can prove this for yourself. They want to pull oil from deeper than 1,000 meters. Why? Why do they have to drill for oil? They have to drill it because they're trying to access those layers, those sedimentary layers that compressed those billions and billions and billions of metric tons of creatures that basically were covered and eventually formed into oil. The biomass, in other words, that we were given by microbial or small life towards oil is far, far, far greater than the fraction that we were given from the Jurassic period. So now what we have here is we have two factors that are scientifically irrefutable factors. The first one is we've already proven to you that the atmosphere was unable to sustain life, and only due to the presence of that microbial life as well as the presence of the Carboniferous period were we able to bring about this change. And we've also proven to you where the oil, which is actually it's part of that same period, roughly a period of almost 1.5 billion years of extracting carbon and bringing it down into their bodies and releasing the oxygen. It's that process that allowed the world to be shaped exactly as we are right now. So here we have a picture. Now we have a planet drifting through time and space that has kilometers and kilometers of oil reserves and coal reserves trapped under the ground. But I want to change your mind from this concept of oil reserves and coal reserves, because it's not really true. They are definitely coal, they are definitely oil, but it's actually a trapped atmosphere. Those pieces of coal and those pieces of those liters of oil are actually the negative, the bad chemical makeup of the atmosphere trapped into the bodies of once living creatures that is trapped underground further and made into coal and oil. So instead of looking at it as coal and oil, you can also look at it as an old atmosphere. If you take that atmosphere, let's say, and you can do this experiment for yourself at home, but if you take any piece of coal and you burn that piece of coal, it's a process that we call oxidization. This is also a scientific, verifiable fact. Once you burn it, it releases, so it takes the oxygen, attaches to the carbon, and is released in the form of smoke. And that's why when you burn it, if you leave your hand in it, you'll see a little black mark, and that's the carbon buildup on the inside of your hand. Now that same carbon buildup, it goes all over the atmosphere, and it builds up in terms of carbon in the atmosphere. And basically, the base mechanic of what we're doing here is we're taking older atmosphere in the form of coal, in the form of oil, we are releasing that back into the atmosphere. So what are we doing in effect? We are reverting the Earth back to a period in which it was not capable to sustain complex life. We are changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere back to a state. We are releasing the carbon. We are undoing the work of those thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of biomass that caused the atmosphere to change, and we are undoing it in a very short space of time. Now, to come back to a point that I find interesting, and just to prove something to you, and this is something you can do yourself, I would like you to go and ask your dad, or if you are a dad, I'd like you to take a look at your electricity bill. Now, your electricity bill will reflect the amount of power that you are using for, say, a month. Now, let's break it down to simple numbers, okay? Let's say, for argument's sake, that you're using 100 kilowatt hours of electricity. Now, that 100 kilowatt hours of electricity, because it is made by a coal-fired power station, there is a relationship to the amount of coal that they put into it versus the amount of energy derived from it. Now, because coal is basically used to heat up steam, so they drive steam turbines, there's an inefficiency to that. So the amount of coal versus the amount of electricity is almost equivalent. It takes 1 kilogram of coal to give you 1 kilowatt of electricity. This is almost a worldwide standard. In some areas it's slightly less, in some areas it's slightly more. In South Africa it's slightly more. And it's based on the quality of the coal or the energy density of the coal, and it's based on the amount of losses along the transmission. But to put this in perspective, let's say that your electricity bill is about 100 kilowatts. That's 100 kilograms of charcoal to make your electricity. Now multiply this by every house. Go look outside the window, see all the lights on, see them all burning, shining brightly, putting up beautiful things. That electricity is created from the trapped bodies of all of those trees. And what we're doing is, and microbes, and what we're doing is, we're releasing it back into the atmosphere to give us power. And likewise with fuel. So if you take a look at a car, or you take a look at the smog that accumulates above every city, it's like this giant orange or browny orange kind of, and in some cases as the sun goes through it, the sun looks pink. It looks kind of beautiful. But the fact is that is smog that's accumulated as a result of carbon monoxide, which is the byproduct of the combustion process of oil and fuel. And that's what's happening. That carbon monoxide is disappearing back up into the atmosphere, and we are once again reverting our current atmospheric makeup into a past atmospheric makeup. So, and we already know that past atmospheric makeup was incapable of sustaining life. So there you have what is called the basic mechanics of climate change. This is basic. There is nothing complex, there is nothing refutable about what I'm saying. You can test it for yourself, you can read it for yourself, you can go and research it until you're pink. Everything that I've said here is scientifically quantifiable. So what then is climate change, and what is all the hullabaloo? If the climate has been varying over the course of 2.5 billion years, why now is it all of a sudden a problem? Well, that's very simple. And this was actually a common question that was posed to me inside of the article, well, not the article, but both of our social media sites. So I'm going to answer this quite plainly. It is very true that climate change has occurred naturally over the course of the world's history. It's very true. It is, there's nothing complex about it. It has to have changed. Once Egypt used to be a jungle, it was jungle, and now it is desert. So climate change has to have occurred. But the difference here is, generally speaking, most climate changes on the level that we are now. So just to put you in perspective, since the early 1960s, we have climbed 120 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide, which means that we are sitting on levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere last seen 94 million years ago. Now that's quite a statement. And again, you can go check this out for yourself. How do we know this? It comes from ice core samples, rock samples, and basically trapped gas particles within that rock that enable us to determine atmospheric makeup inside of a certain area. So, I come back to the point, most of those periods where carbon dioxide was at the levels that we are now resulted in an ice age. They did. And the reason they resulted for the ice age was because the Earth has its own natural sinks. So the carbon goes up, the Earth slowly sequesters that carbon, but during that process, it brings about an ice age. And in most of these ice ages, most, if not near to all, life on Earth was made to go extinct. It was a time in which nothing, almost nothing, could survive. You saw the decline and the wipeout of thousands and thousands of species that we'll never even hear about as a result of these massive variations. Now, a lot of people say, and this came up as well, what caused those variations? I mean, how was the kind of planet going to get to those high levels now? I mean, maybe it's just doing that again. Well, the answer again is no. You see, back then, there was super volcanoes. There was events, catastrophic sometimes events, that took place on the planet, meteor impacts and dramatic events that caused this amount of carbon dioxide, not only carbon dioxide, but sulfur, nitrogen, various other atmospheric kind of chemicals that altered the environment, that brought about those ice ages that almost wiped out every living thing on the planet. So, my point, in terms of natural variation that happens inside of the planets, it does happen. There is a natural variation to climate, just not to the extent that we're seeing. Most of that carbon was sequestered over, well, first of all, it was created over sometimes long periods, sometimes short periods. But the most important thing to remember here is that the planet had built-in sinks. There was an abundance of life. They absorbed that extra carbon. They basically brought the planet back to a state of equilibrium. And that was because we hadn't played our part towards screwing that up. Now what we've done is we've not only started destroying all the natural sinks, so then this is like wiping out the forest, destroying the oceans, wiping out pretty much anything that has anything healthy, microbes in the soil, anything that the planet used to use to pull that carbon dioxide back and bring about a balance in the climate, those things are gone now. We've destroyed a lot of them with chemicals, logging, and paper, if you think about it. So the reality is, although that there is a climate variation, it is no longer possible for most species to survive as a result of that climate variation. And then the repair of that climate variation that happened previously was something that the planet could withstand, whereas now it is unable to withstand it. It is unable to tolerate it. And in addition to it, the speed at which we have climbed this, I mean, literally in the space of whatever, it's like 40 years, 50 years, we've risen by 120 parts per million. For the first time in 94 million years, we've driven this planet to over 400 parts per million. And so this is just fact. You can do what you like. You can kind of research it, you can look around it, you can do whatever you like. I mean, we've had a lot of people coming up with some of the most lame concepts. I've had a guy that said, Jason, this is good because this is going to be great for farming. And sure, for a period, I mean, even now, there is evidence to show that the Arctic is greening. And and that's just due to kind of climate variations that are happening as a result of climate change. Because the process is not an extremely rapid process, there will be periods where you will be able to actually enjoy the additional carbon. But it's as I answered that, I said, it's like having a pig. Don't look at it like a tree. It's like a pig. If you give a pig a barn full of food every day, there's only so much the pig's going to eat. It can't eat the amount of carbon that we're putting out. We're putting out so much carbon, it is no longer possible for the sequestration methods to bring it all back into check. So what's happening is the global carbon count is climbing and climbing and climbing. Another popular argument that I had was, no, this has to do with solar radiation. And it's true, you see, it's not actually untrue, it's true. The problem that we have on the planet is caused by solar radiation, but it's not caused by an expanding sun or a solar flare or a variation, transient variation in the sun's output. What it is caused by is solar radiation coming in from the sun and being able being unable to escape back into the atmosphere. This is basic common knowledge. Also, should it have ever have been solar radiation, the fact of the matter is that no amount of solar radiation can account for the volume of carbon dioxide that we are seeing in the atmosphere. Then you've got a guy that basically said, well, look, here on my farm, it doesn't really make much difference to me. And I'm going to answer that by saying, of course it doesn't make much difference to me. It doesn't make much difference to anybody. People can say that it's, that it's a ploy, which is a very, very, very popular kind of reasoning. They said it, no, it's some liberalist plot. It's some method of trying to get carbon taxation and trying to get cash. Everything reverts back to cash, and the fear of losing money. And I understand that, times are tight. And you can go and shout all you want from the top of a mountain, and you can go say anything you want about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or about how a carbon tax is evil or whatever you like. But all I ask you is, while you're on top of that mountain, I'd like you to look over a city. And I'd like you to take a look at the amount of smog that is over those cities and then ask yourself, where does that all go? Then when you go back into your shower that night and you showering yourself and you putting shampoo or whatever, you're washing the deodorant off from under your arms and you see those chemicals running down the drain, ask yourself this, where does it all go? When you're doing any kind of farming and you're sitting there spraying down with pesticide in the hopes that you're kind of going to get rid of some kind of species that is irritating you, ask yourself, where does it go? You see, the fact of the matter is that it's not just you, it's 7 billion people around the globe doing exactly what you're doing. They're all doing it. They are all watching the pollution and not giving a second thought as to where it goes. They are all washing chemicals off themselves and not caring about the net result. Well, what I'm telling you, what I told you in that last movie, is that the net result is coming for all of us. All of us are going to pay for that net result. And it is going to happen no matter what I say, no matter what you say, no matter what anybody says. It is a process that is already occurring. If you do yourself a little favor and go Google extreme climate news and take a look at the extreme climates that are happening around the world. Take a look at ocean acidification. Go see what the net results of ocean acidification are for yourself. When you take a look at some kind of politician politicizing regarding carbon tax, ask yourself this. If I have a company and my company was to manufacture, let's say my company was to manufacture drinking fountains. But as a result, I was also using tubes that would release arsenic into the water, and thousands of people died as a result of that. Am I not responsible for that? Am I not responsible for the net result of my business activities? Because if I'm not responsible, well, then that's fine. Then oil companies and companies that are destroying the environment are not responsible either. But I find it a little ironic how it is that if I make a product that kills millions of people, that I'm responsible, but companies that are already doing this are somehow immune. It's just another carbon taxation scheme. It's not. It's about making a company accountable for its actions. They are producing a product that is destroying the planet around you, and they need to be held to account. It's just that simple. It's not some political plot. So, I hope I've managed to bring this kind of all to your attention. I hope I've managed to clear up some of the things. I'm certain that I will get some weird comments again. I had a guy saying it was an alien conspiracy. But the net result of what I'm trying to do is give you a basis on which you yourself can go and check this information. It's like I said to everybody, I said, prove me wrong. Find me information that proves me wrong, and I will publish a statement retracting everything I've said. But the fact is, it's not there. What I'm saying is the truth. We're in deep trouble. We're not going to get out of this trouble by putting our head in the sand. We're not going to get out of this trouble by doing nothing. We're not going to have a normal day every day for very much longer. What you need to do is share this information. Don't take it from me. Don't believe me. Research it yourself. find the information, share the information. More people need to talk about this. Once a number of people, let's call it a biomass of people, are talking about the information, you will see that politics will change to correspond with what is interesting to the people. It is therefore your duty to do this. More importantly, and hopefully, a couple of those guys that were out there that were actually standing up for us and fighting with me against this influx of madness that we had about how it was just a hoax and how Al Gore just manufactured the whole thing. But those guys, if you're hearing this, make a little clip. Go out yourself. Take a look at what's going on in your area. Send me a clip. Let's put it up. Let's start to build our network. Let's start to share information. And let's start to bring about some kind of change. And I just think that together we can actually solve this problem. So, I'd like to thank you for your time, for watching Jason on the Mother Channel on Environmental News Network. It was great to bring you this update. On Sunday, which in 2 days' time, I'm going to bring you some news, regular news stories. There's some really big news stories coming out, but I will bring you an update on Sunday. This was basically just to bring you the basics of climate change, and I hope you all have a good day. Thanks.
When I first started to look into the issue of biofuels, or more aptly called agrofuels, I was shocked to see the speed and scale at which this has developed over just in the last 2 years. Millions and millions of hectares of land being converted into the production of monocrops for transport energy. And billions of dollars passing through hands internationally, making deals to facilitate this industry. And policy mechanisms being put into place to mandate targets for large amounts of biofuels in countries like the European Union and the United States, where we use a lot of transport fuel. So having those mandates in place is going to provide a huge impetus to this market. The scale is enormous, and the pace at which it is happening is incredibly fast. It's hard to keep up with. One of the things that is most concerning is that agrofuels are being promoted as a solution to climate change. Well, if you look just at what is happening in the combustion chamber of an automobile, you might be able to make that argument. But if you look further beyond that at the impacts that growing millions and millions of hectares of fuel crops has on the global climate, you cannot no longer make that argument. It becomes completely invalidated, because agriculture has a huge impact on global climate. Global warming, obviously we all know that here, is not just about emissions of greenhouse gases, it's also about protecting and enhancing the carbon sinks in our ecosystems. So turning them into millions and millions of hectares of soy crops and palm oil is not the way to go to protect those ecosystems. This push to promote agrofuels in this transition into using agrofuels on a large scale is driving deforestation. In the United States, we have been using corn to make ethanol, and the demand for corn has escalated to the point where farmers have switched over from growing soy, into growing corn for ethanol production. This has caused a rise in the price of soy, which has caused countries like Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina to step up to the plate and fulfill the global demand for soy, which is now not being fulfilled by the United States. And so agricultural lands are expanding into the forest frontier in places like the Brazilian Amazon as a result of that chain of events and that chain of connections. Over the past few years, Brazil is actually boasting a reduced rate of deforestation, but as agri-fuels have come onto the horizon, the rates of deforestation have escalated. In the past year, up about 8%. And in some areas of the Brazilian Amazon, much higher rates, just between 2006 and 2007, correlated with the increased price of soy. So that is just one example of where we see that agri-fuels are promoting deforestation. We cannot call it a solution to climate change because it is ruining the carbon sinks that we have. Other good example is from Indonesia, and I won't go into that in great detail because I believe Abdon is going to talk about palm oil. But palm oil has been expanding very rapidly. There's discussion about a 43-fold increase in palm oil plantations. We're talking about Borneo and Sumatra being 98% deforested by, I believe it is 2012, if I remember correctly, as a result of the expansion of palm oil, which is of course used as a food oil, but also as a feedstock for biodiesel. Again, agri-fuels pushing deforestation. Not only is it pushing deforestation, but it's pushing people off of their land. We can't possibly meet the kind of demand that we have for transport fuels from plant biomass without planting enormous areas of the Earth's surface with plants for fuel crops. And to do that, we have to use the land. How are we going to get access? Whose land is that? What is on that land? Those are the questions we have to ask. There are some projects, for example, in Kalimantan Border Project, where there's discussion of 5 million indigenous people being displaced for an oil palm plantation. Not only is it impacting indigenous people, it's impacting the prices of food worldwide, and therefore it's a serious threat to food availability and food production and food sovereignty in many countries. And mind you, it is the northern countries where we drive automobiles for personal use for the most part that are driving this whole process. But it is the southern countries where the sun shines, the labor is cheap, and the land is accessible and available that are paying the price in terms of land and food sovereignty for this. So one of the UN Special Rapporteur on Food recently put out a report in which he said that the production of agri-fuels is a crime against humanity, given that 854 million people a year are suffering chronic malnutrition, and millions of children are dying of starvation. To be converting land into the production of fuel crops is a crime against humanity, he said, and called for a moratorium. There are moratorium calls coming from different parts of the world right now. We have one in the United States, which is just coming out. Africa just also put out a call for a complete moratorium on this until it has been thought through more carefully. The solution that is being promoted by the people who are promoting this industry is to move towards further technologies, second generation technologies, if you will, involving the conversion of cellulose from plant material into ethanol instead of using starch in sugar crops like sugarcane and corn. But if we move towards using these other crops, one of the very likely ones is to switch over to using trees. Right now we're looking at a 5-fold expansion in demand for pulp and paper products in the world. We're looking at huge areas of the forest being converted into monoculture tree plantations for various different purposes. We're looking at countries mandating the use of wood for energy and electricity production. How much can we rely on trees and still maintain them as carbon sinks? Can we also produce transport fuel from them? Given the scale of demand for transport fuel, it will mean that vast areas of the forest will have to be converted into plantations for that purpose. I just want to end by saying the agri-fuels industry has nothing to do with climate change and with protecting the global climate. It has nothing to do with people and their rights or food access or anything like that. It is a strategy by corporations who stand to benefit from this, and it is the same corporations like the oil industries, agribusiness, the biotechnology corporations who are genetically engineering various things for use for energy crops. Those are the driving forces behind this. It has nothing to do with global warming. However, it's absolutely relevant to everything we're talking about here, especially deforestation. Thank you.
IPCC report?
Well, if we do nothing, then the world is reasonably expected to continue to warm, possibly between about 1.5 and maybe up to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, with changes in rainfall patterns and extremes of weather as well, and with a variety of impacts around the world, such as on the melting of glaciers and ice caps, which ultimately will contribute to sea level rise, but over a long period of time. But sea level will be rising because of the ice melt and also because water expands as it warms. Changes in rainfall patterns would affect the viability of different ecosystems and different species around the world, and the viability of crops and water resources in some regions as well. So we can expect a whole range of impacts. Some of them might actually be good, but many of them will be bad.
And the violent weather was the bad one, part of the bad
one. Under a warmer climate, you might expect more extremes, particularly in terms of perhaps extreme thunderstorms. If you've got a hot ground, you get more intense convection, so more intense rainfall. If you've got a warmer sea surface, any hurricanes that form might be more intense as well. Under drought conditions, if you've got hotter temperatures, that leads to more evaporation of the soil moisture, so a more intense drought as well. So a whole range of different things, yes.
Now, contrary to the meeting that we've just heard now, the ice in the Arctic Circle, and in particular in Greenland, because that's the ice that's above the ground is of course more concern than the ice that's already in the water, is likely to melt. Have you got any idea of at which stage, which part of the century, of this period between now and 2100, it's going to possibly disappear altogether?
Well, I don't think we'll see the loss of the Greenland ice cap for many centuries or beyond, in actual fact. That was one thing where he did get right, that the rate of melting is very slow. But there's a lot of ice there, and that's partly why it takes a long time to disappear. But as it melts, it would still input more water to the sea, and therefore increase sea level. And another point is that once it starts, you may get past a threshold where it's impossible to stop. So maybe you set in place this legacy for future generations, many decades and many generations down the line. So even if we do bring climate change back again and bring temperatures back down again, that Greenland and its melting may be irreversible.
Do you see people in the first world as actually experiencing anything that might make them uncomfortable, or do you think that their children will experience that, because that's something else that might concern them as well?
I think we will experience things soon. In fact, we're already experiencing some consequences of climate change now already. For example, in 2003, there was a very extreme heat wave in Europe, and there were many thousands of excess deaths during the peak of that heat wave. And now in the Hadley Centre, we've established that that level of heat wave is now twice as likely as it would have been without climate change. So although you do get heat waves anyway from time to time, they're now becoming more intense. And in fact, that kind of extreme heat wave from 2003, we'd expect that to happen every other year in the middle of this century, and then beyond that, that would be commonplace, and even a relatively cold year. But that's one example of how we are already seeing things which seem to be the effects of climate change. So we're seeing climate change already.
When we were looking at the internet in 2002, there were a number of internet articles which said that the Gulf Stream stopping is something that would not necessarily happen very gradually, but it's like putting your finger on a light switch. There's suddenly a moment at which it suddenly clicks into action. In your Hadley Centre models, do you feel that is possible, and that Britain could suddenly find itself plunged into an ice age?
it's theoretically possible that the Gulf Stream could shut down because of an increased input of fresh water from the melting of the Greenland ice cap. However, none of the computer models actually show that happening this century. So it's a very difficult situation. It's theoretically possible, but it seems to be unlikely. However, if it did happen, then the consequences for Europe and particularly for the UK would be quite dramatic. We'd get winters as cold as central Russia, for example. So we're talking about a high impact, low probability scenario. We think it's unlikely, but if it does happen, the consequences are severe.
Do you think that it could actually be slightly mitigated by having global warming simultaneously warming?
Exactly. If the Gulf Stream doesn't shut down for another century or so, then the level of warming which would already have happened could largely cancel out the cooling there. So the temperature in the UK wouldn't be that much affected. But if it happened in the next decade, then the consequences would be large. So it depends when it happens. It's more likely to happen as time goes on, but we don't really know the probability.
Would the United States of America experience the same result, especially the East Coast?
Not so much, really. It's mostly Western Europe which is kept warm by the Gulf Stream.
As follows. At the moment, this conference seems to be quite content to work out how to cap the emissions in such a way as to limit the increase in temperature to 2 degrees centigrade maximum. However, I've noticed that there's some quite serious reductions. Serious things happen to biological communities, as little as 7.7 or 1 degree even hotter. In fact, it's already happening for the polar bears, for example. Could you tell me, is there any of the affected species that are potentially key species? For example, I've been getting reports about loss of bees. There's like they're almost disappearing altogether, and they're very important for pollinating fruit and trees.
That's a very difficult question to answer, really. I think because it's difficult to identify key species, and it's also very difficult to assess extinction risk as well. Particularly when you're more certain about the global mean temperatures, the average temperature, the average warming around the world. If you're looking at individual locations, that depends on the local weather and climate, and we're much more uncertain about how different local climates will change because of climate change. So it's quite difficult to put sort of hard numbers on extinction risks and so on. But I think one of the key things is if there was a large rate of climate change, if there's fast climate change, then many species may not be able to adapt to that, and that's when you get the risks of extinctions. It's difficult to give timing of extreme events. We can estimate the average rate of change over the century, but of course on top of the sort of gradual change, you've always got year-to-year variations anyway. Some years are warmer and some years are cooler. So if you've got a few naturally warm years on top of this rate of warming, then that's when you can get an even greater temporary warming. And it's these kind of things which may have a greater impact in actual fact. So that's more difficult to predict. Yeah, you're quite right.
You have children?
Yes, two, yes.
Do you fear for the future for your children? Do you think that this got any chance of anything we're doing here, or in the way the world will respond to the problem, that will give your children a future?
I do think that my children will see a different world when they're even my age, and certainly by their grandfather's age. I am optimistic that we can perhaps slow the rate of climate change and also adapt to climate change to some extent. But there's no doubt that the world will be different, and we'll have to learn to live with it, I think. Generally, the most important thing is to think about the consequences of our actions, and not just now for ourselves in the immediate future, but in the longer term and for other people, and think about your role in the whole world and how what you do can affect people thousands of miles away via the climate system. There's many things that you can do to minimise your impact on the climate.
What would you choose? If you said you've got to stop?
An immediate thing, which is an obvious thing, is to reduce damage to ecosystems, because Damage to ecosystems affects climate change by emitting greenhouse gases and also destroying their services such as rainfall production and so on. Also it conserves biodiversity, which is good in itself and also on which the livelihoods of a lot of people depend. So there's many win-wins within sort of conserving ecosystems, and that's an obvious first thing to do. Then in the longer term, look for alternative energy sources. I would say it's such a complex problem that we have to still tread carefully and not make any rash decisions on this. It's a very serious issue, but we still don't know the perfect answers. So I wouldn't rush ahead with extreme changes. I would move carefully towards a new system, really.
There seems to be some very big differences, and I can't understand why, as to how much, if all the ice were to melt, that the sea level would rise by.
Yes.
Do you have a fairly accurate picture of how much the ice would rise by? Not the ice, the sea levels would rise by if all the we melted completely and we had zero ice on Earth?
That's probably a figure I should look up to be sure I get the right number.
Okay. I don't know.
Because it's about 60 metres if all of Antarctica melted.
60?
Yeah, something like that.
That's what I thought too.
Yes, yeah. But of course, the most of Antarctica is actually quite stable. Some parts of Antarctica, the West Antarctic ice sheet might be more vulnerable, so that's more likely to be the area where we'd get ice melt from the Antarctic. In Greenland, of course, then we could set in train an irreversible long-term melting, and that would rise sea levels by 7 metres.
Then why it gets hotter at the poles and it gets...
The warming is greater at the poles because you get this feedback process from the melting of snow and ice. Snow and ice has a cooling effect on the climate by reflecting sunlight back to space. So as you start to melt the snow and melt the ice, you expose the dark underlying land surface or dark underlying ocean that absorbs more of the sun's energy and has a further warming effect. And that's where you get more warming in the regions which are cold at the moment.
Does that the same thing apply to forests? Would forests therefore be hot places because they're dark green, and dark green will absorb heat?
It depends where you are. In the northern forests, okay, in the boreal forest regions, the northern forests such as Russia and Canada, they do act to warm their local climate by absorbing some of the sun's energy. In the tropics, however, tropical forests have a double cooling effect. They lock up carbon from the atmosphere, but they also cool the world by evaporating water, and that has a cooling effect. So it depends which forest you're talking about, really. Sunlight is short wavelengths, and terrestrial radiation, heat radiation given off by the Earth, is long wave radiation, infrared radiation, basically, and that's what's trapped by greenhouse gases.
So does that not mean that to have no reflection off the ice caps would mean that the ones that get caught won't be getting caught? In other words, you see what I'm saying?
It's different because reflection is actually reflecting the sunlight, the shortwave, back to space.
In the same
yes.
Same speed.
The greenhouse effect is affecting infrared radiation, which is sunlight absorbed by the land surface, yes. The land surface or the ocean surface then heated up and then given off infrared radiation in the long wave, and that's what's trapped. So reflecting the sunlight doesn't really interact with the greenhouse effect. It's different wavelengths.
Strain on other foreign countries that are trying to do their utmost best to preserve their conservation and wildlife species. And this demand is being fueled by extremely wealthy organized crime syndicates, including individuals and gangs, which are fueling this multi-billion industry, annual industry on wildlife trafficking. And it puts a huge amount of strain on the countries that are prepared to fight it. They are taking responsibility. and a serious look at this, and trying to fight this war, which is costing these countries, which are generally third world developing countries, that have many of the different diversity of wildlife species, and they need to fund this and fund their law enforcement units, game reserves and vehicles. It's a huge expense on a monthly or yearly time period, and the governments need to become as involved as possible, as these are natural resources, which is a huge financial income for the country, which will help with employment, which will generally have a knock-on effect with other criminal activities, not only with wildlife. There's a number of other aspects that are all interlinked with these organized crime syndicates. And one of the biggest things I am personally finding as a struggle, which is becoming a bit of a problem, is the lack of support from certain governments around the world and their interaction, and collaboration between international governments, and enforcing the laws. So there seems to be quite a lot of pressure coming from organizations. There's manpower, there's resources, there's financial funding available, and passion. And these companies and organizations are prepared to get involved and stop the wildlife trafficking in different countries all over the world. But unfortunately, you cannot just, as an organization, stop vehicles and check shipments that are coming into ports and harbors. So you need the support from the government and local law enforcement agencies in order to search and seize any articles that you may find. So at the moment, most organizations are gathering intelligence, working as closely with law enforcement agencies and local government agencies, passing on the information and hoping that they then act on it. So the organizations are basically acting as advisors to the government, but at the end of the day, it's unfortunately completely up to the government in what role they play in trying to curb this international anti-poaching.
Would you go so far as to say that in actual fact the actions of government by forbidding the people who are prepared to search all those containers and monitor what's going out in the ships, but they need the backup from government, or they need that they would have some kind of authority? Do you think that we should? Do you think that maybe the governments are actually working on behalf of those groups who are actually trying to poach all these things?
Yes, I think unfortunately, because of the financial gain, the amount of money that exchanges in hands, a lot of people are influenced into this, including government members. The guys that we entrust to do the searching at the customs, at the airports, at the harbors, they will definitely be influenced and enticed into conducting illegal activities, letting shipments in. And then there's also the diplomatic problem, where we have the immunity. Government members traveling internationally and claim to be a diplomat and have ease of access, so nobody stops them to search them, nobody confiscates anything, and they just have free flow of passage, basically from one country to another, which gives them a great opportunity to take advantage of smuggling wildlife or any other illegal products internationally.
So basically, what are the things that can be done within this context, when you've got a government who's working with the baddies, possibly? What can you do at all that could stem this terrible tide of extinction process?
Yeah, that's something that everybody has to work together, very closely together, support each other. I think unfortunately there's always going to be that rotten apple in the bag that's going to also affect everybody else, or a lot more other people. It's definitely going to be a new approach. I'm not too sure exactly how to answer this question. What is going to be the best way to to prevent this from continuing, because it is happening. But the visual policing, the gathering of intelligence, and just the basic general support from private organizations, NGOs, professionals in the industry who understand the current situation, and get the point across that we need to act now in order to stop all wildlife illegal activities, as these continue to have a knock-on effect on everything else that we do, and of our survival as humankind.
So, if you were to be able to administer a truth drug, which I believe that does exist, which would compel people to tell the truth, or alternatively a lie detector test, which we use all the time routinely, and if people who were actually working as operatives for the bad boys, therefore were to reveal themselves without their realizing that they are, would that be of much help in your field?
Absolutely. Interesting question. A couple of years ago, a lot of private sector game reserves, and including national parks, I believe, started using these lie detector tests. Basically, as you conduct an interview for a new staff member to join your team, they will undergo a lie detector test. And what this test will give to us is basically we will have an understanding of if this person is trustworthy. Has this person ever been involved in any illegal activity, specifically with wildlife poaching? Have they ever supported it? Do they know anybody who is directly involved? Do they know any members on the park? So yes, I think that this can help. It can. It's intelligence. So basically, it gives us a bit of a pre-warning before we start signing contracts and offering people permanent positions, that will have the opportunity to be around these endangered wildlife species on a daily basis, and have access to very sensitive and personal information about the whereabouts of the wildlife. So the lie detector tests definitely help, but I am not sure if they can be technically used to prevent somebody from continuing a current job position. So if you were to conduct a lie detector test with a current employee, I do not think that you could use that in the court of law, depending on what answers, what information you got back from the results of the test.
Well, that's one thing that we could change. We could change the legislation that says that lie detector tests are not a reason for dismissal or for non-hiring.
Yes.
That would certainly help, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, the thing that it seems very much is that you've got a lot of money on the side that are bent on getting rid of all the species, and you've got not sufficient money, or you have got some money, but you have got a lot of hands being tied behind the back of those people who want to spend money on saving the ecosystems and the wildlife.
Correct. There's a huge amount of money involved, especially from, should we say, the bad side, the organized criminal syndicates. They have access to billions of US dollars, and we are trying to fight this fight, which is costing us, the state, the government, and the private sector, huge amounts of money to try and counter this poaching. So the organized crime units definitely have an upper hand, and we need to work more closer together and collaborate in order to have these funds become more effective. A lot of private agencies are also trying to claim a status. So if they are to make an arrest of a rhino poacher, it looks very good for their organization and they get the claim to fame. So I think one of the major aspects that we can do to conserve wildlife and to prevent and try to control wildlife trafficking needs to start internationally from the east, and we need to work closer with the governments. We need more and more support from our local government agencies, including the international ones. And then what we need to do is also continue as we are currently doing, is with education in these countries, because they do not have the same wildlife species we have. So they do not have a great understanding of the necessity of these animals and why they are so important. So from a government perspective, collaboration, interaction between international governments, support from the educational side of it, and more resources within South Africa. So with laws, we need to strengthen as many political laws as possible to have lengthier sentences. If we could have a minimum of a 20-year sentence, depending on the crime of the activity of the wildlife poaching, I think that this will act as a very good deterrent to future poachers and organized crime units, that the government of South Africa is taking a responsible and a very direct action against illegal wildlife activities. There are a number of other resources that we could use in order to counter the poaching that we lack in. Most of the time it's very huge, vast areas that we are trying to patrol in with wilderness areas, so virtually zero access by vehicle, or everything is only accessible by foot. So operating with light aircraft, fixed-wing airplanes and helicopters would help amazingly towards countering poaching and covering huge spaces of land in a short period of time, which could save on a lot of financial resources and funding.
What about operating at night? Is that difficult?
Operating at night is extremely difficult. We do not fly the helicopters at night because we have electrical wiring coming across the reserves from Eskom. We operate on foot during night patrols. We also utilize night vision, military night vision optics in order to counter poaching and prevent an incursion of poachers and anti-poaching rangers running in and having confrontation. It's also very good to illuminate wildlife. As I mentioned before, there's a potential threat from the wildlife that we are trying to protect ourselves. Rhino and elephant, lion, buffalo, these are all quite a major threat, especially at night time. So yeah, we need to continue 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to try to counter this poaching.
I want to zoom back out from the ground and go up to the level of an institutional investor. Ole Sorensen is here with us today. He's the Chief of Strategy and Research of ATP, which is one of the Danish very large institutional investors in this space.
The dialogue between the policy community and the investment community is so weak, I simply do not get it. Kyle and Nick was on the AGF, the advisory group on climate finance set up by the General Secretary of the United Nations earlier this year to sort of, at least starting, sort of chart this territory for us. I think that's a major achievement, but if you look at it from sort of a little greater distance, you could ask yourself, why did that happen in 2010? Why didn't it happen in 2005, 2002? I don't know. We need strong policy commitments. That will be the key message you will hear from any institutional investor around the world. We need clear and sustainable long-term policy commitments. Because if we do not have this kind of commitment, institutional investors cannot do what they're supposed to do as investors. They cannot engage with companies on their climate development or climate strategies. They cannot engage with companies on a discussion on how to go about climate risk and make use of climate opportunity. And it's very, very difficult for us to go into the kind of utility investments and other kind of public type investments in developing countries that are related to climate change. You cannot pay your way out of float policies. You simply cannot do that. You may be able to do that, but it takes a lot of money. it may actually be cheaper to get policies right than try to pay your way out of this.
What's the future of carbon trade and carbon finance?
You have to have confidence in where people are going. The European Declaration for 20% reduction 1919 to 2020 is, I think, credible. I'd like it to be a bit more credible. I'd like it to be 30%. But these are the kinds of things that we have to look for in building that confidence.
One is, I don't think we will see the international agreement. It would be very good. We have actually a working group in the UK thinking about, couldn't we as business community go ahead and simply shadow price carbon? Shell is doing that in some respects. 25 is too low. But so maybe even there, what I call about the coalitions of like-minded businesses, we should explore that. But yes, we need that carbon price, but we are not on a very good track at the moment. And you are living in the US, you know what I'm talking about.
The ideas are about the alternative route. It's very important that people understand the risks, but if it's just frightening people, it's not going to get anywhere. Those ideas have to be about what we can do and why it's attractive. And behind the ideas will be examples. It's the power of the example, I think, that will give us particularly something to express. The Industrial Revolution will be in large measure in agriculture. It will be everywhere. And we have to be able to show to people what's going on. University teachers like myself have a job to do. Particularly journalists have a job to do.
Thank you for the presentations. Thank you for calling for an industrial revolution. I believe it's highly welcome. We need it. But I'm missing one element. We do not only need an industrial revolution. We need a revolution in people's minds. We need people to accept the possibility that we go through another revolution. And there are elements in our society that need to support this process, I believe. We have come from a guilt and sin-oriented society, and the churches have played a tremendous role in this. And we need to be based on creativity. We need to employ the engagement of all the people that can participate in this revolution. And that is the majority. The main investment we have to do is not financial, I believe. It is human. How do you want to motivate humans to participate, to believe that this is a future-oriented process?
Thank you. We cannot wait for governments to move on this. We are moving forward. We are going to invest $1 billion in countries around the world that have proactive environmental standards. Where are you investing and how are you going about it?
We're announcing, OPIC is announcing today, as part of the U.S. government's and the President Obama's commitments to Copenhagen and to Fast Start, an initiative that we hope will raise $1 billion in new financing for climate change related investments in emerging markets. And specifically, next week on December 15th, we'll be doing a global call for proposals for equity funds interested in investing in the sector climate change related finance, meaning all kinds of renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, waste to energy, that's for you, as well as the infrastructure for other kinds of natural resources like water, agriculture, land, etc. OPIC itself will put in at least 300, we hope more, $1 million to support the equity funds that compete successfully in this. And we think this is a very exciting thing. It will be the largest commitment that OPIC has made in the sector to date, and it will be one of the largest initiatives that the U.S. government has put forth to support climate change mitigation in emerging markets to date, too.
Social security reform, China, as you said, doesn't overpromise, it overperforms. But I truly believe that with this Leadership Now 12-year plan, and the way you do it in other fora, I was involved when we created the G20 among finance ministers, but China very much understood, but the systemic significance comes systemic responsibility. That China will also take the next step now, beyond the admirable progress back home, of leading internationally in its very wise and long-term way. The world needs that, and China will look good. MRV, for example, I understand China is now more amenable because you will look much better than the Americans and others when these things are measured. Again, as a personal impression and being close to the dialogue that takes place in the party and in China, I hope this next step will come in the next leadership change.
I think we've shifted in the business community and the finance community. We talk about opportunity. We see the size of this, multi-trillion-dollar market, as Richard Branson talked about yesterday. But it's very difficult to frame the question of opportunity when you're talking in developing countries with people who feel that they have not been at the table, that they've had no stake in how they ended up where they are, and for whom this is a debate about existence. It's about the way in which their families are going to survive, and it's the way in which they can even have an aspiration for their kids and for their kids' kids. And so I think that in the past, the language of risk was off-putting to business. The sort of public policy language didn't allow the private sector. The private sector has taken the debate, talked about opportunity, but now that opportunity sticks in the claw, really, of those who still feel that they're not really at the table and don't have a stake in the future. I think language gets in the way, and especially at the international level. And so it's at the national level, it's at the community level where you start seeing people starting to build, a shared vision of the future. For political leaders, then I think it's how do you imagine what the future looks like? And I think some of the work that actually happened before Copenhagen and after Copenhagen, helping political leaders imagine what a decarbonised economy looks like in their country in the next 20 years. That is not an easy thing to do. And that's the conversation then that has to take place between political leaders and people with the business community part of it. So again, it's going to be a bottom-up story. You're not going to get a shift in language and an idiom that expresses and embraces how this is everybody's shared right. That's not going to happen at the international level. It's going to be a bottom-up shift in language to represent the ethic that you talk about.
Thank you, Rachel.
Take a few minutes to basically make a bridge from accelerating capital through to making mass change with information and communication. Basically, there's three driving beliefs here, and we've heard them from the panels previously. It's a job too complex for governments alone. Businesses have to act. It's the economic opportunity of our generation to sort this, and actually we need to dive into sectors in order to make the solutions real. So, it's not for governments alone. It's been said that there's three souffles that have to rise together: policy, capital, and technology, in order to make a working marketplace to solve this problem. Policy is a necessary but insufficient condition to get things done, and technology is arguably not the bottleneck. So we have to focus on capital and moving capital in. Can we afford it? We've heard this before as well. We can afford it. The climate wealth opportunity. The left side of the cost curve basically shouldn't be there. This is opportunities that make money on existing situation. A price on carbon, better policy, all that does is move that x-axis up. So where's this capital coming from? Estimates from Spring Ventures. There's $300 billion of philanthropic capital out there allocated. 18,000 billion of government money, but $125 trillion of private money. So we think we know where this capital is coming from. How much do we need? 550 billion a year, it's been said by Bloomberg and NEF and others. It's less than 1%. So less than 1% of private capital allocations have to shift to all the opportunities on the left side of the cost curve you've just seen. Sectors that matter though. We have to dive into the sectors. Where you find the sectors is where you find the market failures, where you find the reasons that capital are being blocked, and where you find the co-benefits in order to get out of that situation and move forward and accelerate capital into those markets. So take shipping, and that's a preview of our announcement that will actually be coming in full tomorrow at COP, but we wanted to preview to the delegates here and some of you who may not be joining us in the halls tomorrow. Diving into the sector like shipping. Take shipping. It's 1 billion tons of CO2. If it was a country, it would be the 6th largest country in the world, in between Germany and Japan. On a SOx, NOx, and PM level, it's even worse. One large ocean-going vessel pollutes the same as 50 million cars in SOx terms. 15 large ocean-going vessels are polluting the same in SOx as the entire world stock of cars right now. This is a sector that can get better. Even though it's the most efficient form of transport for goods, it can get better. And luckily, it can get better economically too. DNV have done their own cost curve just within shipping. There are dozens of technologies that can be fitted to the modern fleet. Retrofitted, hull coatings, software, others, and they all have short paybacks, many under 3 years on a 25-year asset. the ship of tomorrow could look very different from the ship of today. Information is the market failure in shipping. You basically, it's very hard for the actors to tell a good ship from a bad ship, a clean ship from a dirty ship. So what do? We go to the innovators in the industry. It's been heard, we don't need consensus in order to drive change. We need a few leaders on the supply side that say, hey, I want the market to signal who's a good ship and who's a bad ship. And so the industry can put a sticker on the side of every ship. A to G, those in Europe, you're familiar with this sticker on the side of your fridge freezers and on the side of your apartments. And get the industry to say, we want this to happen. It doesn't need everyone, it just needs the market to pull ahead. And on the demand side, imagine the actors can do a Google search on vessels, find a vessel, and then effectively give you the online equivalent of a sticker on the side of every ship. That's our announcement tomorrow, but imagine what can actually happen with this. What can the Port of Los Angeles do with an A-grade ship? Give it an incentive. What can the brand, like Marks & Spencer's or Nike, do with this information? And what can an innovative ship owner like Maersk do, displaying their wares against their competitors? This is a huge opportunity for the market to solve climate change. So, the key point is, this can be done. Businesses must step up and take responsibility. This is the economic opportunity of our generation, and we can't afford it. And sectors matter. We have to dive in. We've got to find out what the market failures are by sector, pull the industry along. The industry doesn't have to act in consensus. Innovators can lead, and that's where we'll find the co-benefits, and that's how we'll solve it.
Only having brought a lot of light to the issue, but also having addressed it in a very positive tone, that we need to address this with respect to the language change that we need to implement to win hearts and minds. At the end of the day, there is no planet B. We may go through life with a plan A and a plan B and a plan C, but there is no planet B. This is the one, and we make a difference. Thank you so much and good morning.
It seems to me that this message from WMO carries with it from the part of policy, and we have made an enormous effort over the years to bridge the gap between science and policy and bring them closer and closer together, because policy must follow science. But it seems to me that from the point of policy, what it calls for is for two characteristics that could seem to be contradictory but are not. One of the characteristics is urgency, and the other one is the gradual nature of the response. Let me explain why these two characteristics are actually not contradictory. The urgency comes from the data that we have just seen, and the urgency is actually to get, as soon as possible, hopefully within this decade, within the next 10 years, to the turning point or the tipping point of where globally, not just in one country, but globally, we would be able to get to global peaking. That means to the maximum level of greenhouse gas emissions per year, and then begin a rapid descent. So the urgency of action, the urgency of getting to the tipping point, I think has been loudly called for by the data that has just been shared. But the other characteristic that must also be understood, and that does not contradict the urgency, is the gradual nature of the decarbonization process. So even when we are able to get to that tipping point, to that inflection point, in which we would get to the maximum level of greenhouse gas emissions, then it will also take a certain period of time to be able to decarbonize the development pathways, in particular developing countries, because they are the ones that are going to have most of the growth in population, most of the growth in energy demand. So it will take time.
as you see pictured here, this is a volcanic carbon dioxide vent, and it's a naturally high carbon dioxide system. Similarly, upwelling regions are naturally high carbon dioxide systems. So today's upwelling regions can provide a window into what future marine communities. To understand upwelling, you can imagine the ocean as a layer cake. So we have deeper layers and we have surface layers. In upwelling regions, those layers are disrupted, and you have your deeper water being brought up to the surface. This deep water is cold and nutrient rich, which supports high fisheries production. However, the water is also high in carbon dioxide, which means it's low in pH, it's more acidic, and it's also low in oxygen. I'm a graduate student at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I live near an important upwelling region off of California. This upwelling region supports many productive fisheries that support our economy as well as recreational fishermen. So where are the upwelling regions of the world, and is there an upwelling region next to your coastline? The ones that I'll be focusing on today are the eastern boundary current regions and the equatorial upwelling region, and you see those circled on the map. And these upwelling regions support productive fisheries around the world, for example, on things like sardines and anchovies. And we see fishermen in Mexico, here in Peru, in Chile, in Namibia, in India, and then also in the US, depending on these productive fisheries in these upwelling regions. So we need to focus on upwelling regions because they both provide a window into what future marine communities will look like if the ocean becomes more acidic and less oxygenated, but also because right now they're very important economic areas, and because they may be vulnerable to changes in ocean acidification because they're already naturally low pH areas. From ocean acidification experiments, we know that there are certain marine organisms that are vulnerable to ocean acidification. These are calcifying mollusks and corals, and they have a harder time building their calcium carbonate shells under these lower pH conditions. In modern day upwelling ecosystems, we do see calcifying mollusks such as oysters and mussels. However, reef-building corals are found in very few upwelling systems today. Furthermore, in upwelling ecosystems, you don't just have to worry about acidification. We mentioned that the characteristics of that water is that it's also very low in oxygen. And this is important because some of the groups that we've seen in studies to be more resistant to low pH conditions, so not as vulnerable to ocean acidification, are the same groups that are very vulnerable to low oxygen. And so in these conditions, fish and crustaceans will be impacted by both stressors, the low oxygen and the low pH. For my PhD, I'm interested in these multi-stressor effects on bottom communities. And particularly, I'm interested in how pH change and oxygen change and temperature change affect bottom fish communities off of California. Although we've talked about how upwelling areas are naturally high carbon dioxide, more acidic areas, they're not immune to the effects of ocean acidification. And in fact, ocean acidification has been observed in multiple upwelling areas. And with the changes in chemistry that have been observed, we've also seen negative impacts on calcifying mollusks. The consistent findings are that things like oysters and mussels and pteropods and abalone are being negatively impacted by these declining pH conditions in upwelling systems. We also see changes in community composition. In these areas where pH has declined, you see shifts from calcifying mussels making up your community to more fleshy algae making up your community. So we're seeing real community shifts. And these community shifts and these biological changes, they're not just great for scientists to talk about, but they're affecting a lot of people economically. In the Northeast Pacific and Washington and Oregon, the oyster hatcheries have experienced a lot of economic costs from this because their larval oysters are dying from the declining pH conditions in the water off their coast. So animals in upwelling areas are going to be increasingly vulnerable because they'll be experiencing these multiple stressors. In the future, they'll be experiencing more acidic surface waters, more acidic upwelled waters, increasing surface temperatures, and then also decreasing oxygen levels. And we really need to think about the impacts of ocean acidification from the cellular and organismal physiology to the greater level of populations and communities of marine organisms, and then to the food web, because it's a healthy food web that sustains our fisheries. And the US is doing a great job monitoring ocean acidification off of our coasts. What about other developing countries like Mexico and Namibia and India that just don't have those same resources but are in these really important upwelling regions? Since upwelling regions are so economically important, we have to think about how ocean acidification is interacting with other climate stressors to affect these marine communities. And I leave you with this take-home message that some of our most productive fishing areas may be the ones most vulnerable to the impacts of ocean acidification.
I'm Ian Keith, I'm with Avaaz, and I'm here today to tell you why I'm excited about what's happening outside of this process, and in particular with regards to the long-term goal and the context that it has in the broader world. I'm excited because I feel like 2014 has been what we would describe as a turning point year. Some of the facts on the ground to support that. One, people power has dramatically risen to meet the climate crisis. In September of this year, we saw the largest ever political mobilization by citizens on the climate issue. Over 670,000 citizens around the world taking to the streets, calling on leaders to do more. In the wake of the People's Climate March, we've seen 1,000 cities around the world, in 1,000 cities around the world, over 1,000 citizens start local campaigns calling on their mayors to go 100% renewable energy. Also, we've got a 2.2 million signer petition for the phase out of carbon emissions and the phase in of 100% renewables, which is part of a core advocacy ask of civil society, certain civil society groups going into Paris. So one of the things that has been lacking for the past couple of years is that really strong showing of broad public support, and this year we've really laid that foundation for it. The second thing that's particularly exciting is that the renewable energy revolution seems to be becoming unstoppable. I'm sure most of you saw the news yesterday that E.ON, one of the largest utility companies in Europe, is kind of turning its back on its coal and gas sectors. The IPCC has said clearly we have to phase out fossil fuels. Finance institutions like the Bank of England, HSBC and Citibank are all doing investigations into the risk of the carbon bubble. And finally, Germany in a single day this year got 75% of its renewable energy, of its electricity from renewable energy sources. The renewable energy revolution is no longer a distant dream, it's actually happening. And the final thing I'd like to say, that's a supporting fact on the ground that really tells this story that we're entering into a turning point on climate change, is that it's becoming clear that 100% renewables and 100% cleaner energy actually doesn't just save the planet, it saves money. Economists are saying if we take action now, we'd save $3 billion a year by 2030. Lower energy use means lower energy bills and lower emissions. And of course, organizations like Avaaz, which are based in New York, experienced firsthand the incredible costs associated with cleaning up climate disasters like the fallout from Hurricane Sandy. So, just to close it out, I think what we're seeing outside of these talks is a lot of momentum, both public and in the economic sector and in the scientific sector. There is a real feeling that things are achievable. What that is yet to translate into is concrete political will in these talks and continue this trajectory towards an unstoppable, clean and renewable energy future. And I think people are going to be there every single step of the way.
So I want to start out reminding ourselves about the leveling satellite fleet that NASA has to study the Earth, and in particular some of the things that are relevant to studies of atmospheric carbon. This represents NASA's research satellites, so it doesn't include the satellites of our operational partners in the US or our international partners. And you get a reminder here about the global coverage that the satellites have. Most of them are traveling 700 to 900 kilometers above the Earth, at 7 kilometers a second, and go around the Earth 14 to 16 times a day, so every 90 to 100 minutes. So it gives us the ability to look at the Earth in unprecedented detail. And some of the sensors are specifically designed to look at atmospheric carbon, like OCO2, stands for Orbiting Carbon Observatory, and of course OCO is the molecular structure of carbon dioxide. And then we'll get some other satellites that will also provide information. The ARPA satellite has the Earth's instrument that measures carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, but OCO2 is a new satellite that was just launched this summer, specifically focusing on carbon dioxide. And of course, a lot of the satellites look at the Earth's surface, so we can obtain information about the vegetation, both terrestrial vegetation and the phytoplankton in the ocean that are responsible for the emission and uptake of CO2. And when we look at the land surface properties, we can understand where the sources of methane are. So we have the ability to relate what's going on in the atmosphere to what's taking place on the surface of the Earth. So, and I'll try to say specifically about some of the kinds of things that we're looking at and the sensors that help us do them. The next imagery shows the Earth's biosphere. This uses 7 years of sequence data, and you've got both the terrestrial biosphere, which is the sort of the green to brown, and then you've got the green biosphere, which is the blue to red. So it's very quickly going through a year here, so you can see the seasonal cycle and see the areas in the tropics. The cycle certainly is not as significant as it is in the extratropics, where you go to high northern latitudes where part of the year is snow covered, and then you can see the vegetation other times. But if you're going to be thinking about atmospheric carbon, it's really valuable to think about the biosphere, because that is where you have emissions and uptake of CO2 from the vegetation. Next, of course, is a reminder that there's also a human component to the atmospheric carbon cycle, especially in terms of activities that we do in terms of burning fossil fuels, as well as changing land cover. So in this case, the night lights, and this uses the Earth's instrument that was the Suomi NVP satellite that was launched in 2011. You see where you've got large concentrations of people and large concentrations of industrial, residential, commercial development, because if you don't have people, you don't have development, you're not going to get the night lights there. So you see the big cities, you can see some other areas where you've got a lot of activity going on in the areas where there's commercial fishing. You can see the lights from the ships that they have for the people working on it. But so those two things in terms of the biosphere and where humans are, that's what's going to be driving the carbon that you see in the atmosphere. So next is shows a little more of the connection. This shows the seasonal cycle in vegetation index. That's sort of in the green, coming from the MODIS instrument for the Tabernacle satellites, and it shows mid-tropospheric CO2 from the Earth's instrument for the Aqua satellites. And if you look at it carefully, you can see the seasonal correlation between the two, because when the biosphere is growing, it can take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and when it's not photosynthesizing, it's expiring, the CO2 gets back in. The Earth's CO2 is it's mid-troposphere, so it's not as directly connected to what's going on at the surface as it might be. And since CO2 has it's a long-lived, well-mixed gas, the gradients are fairly small, so like in this case, if you look at it, the range for the CO2 is 365 to 380 some odd parts per million. So if you look at it, 375 plus or minus about 10, so it's plus or minus about, say, 3%. So you're really looking at some small variations, but there is a correlation that one can see. Next shows some longer-term evolution of carbon dioxide. And what it does is it shows the sort of iconic Mauna Loa CO2 graph, where you can see the seasonal cycle that's superimposed on the steady growth, but then the air's mid-tropospheric CO2 will grow over this time period. So here you're looking at about plus or minus 7 or 8%, so that as the time goes on, you're seeing it going from colorless to green to yellow and red. So you've got the AIRS, was launched in 2002, and it's on the Argus satellite. It's still going there. You can see a little atmospheric gradient, but this just shows that what's going on in the surface obviously connects to what's going on in the middle of the troposphere, and you can really look at that. This is one of the best cited curves that one uses for world studies of climate. You can probably go to this meeting and see that the Mauna Loa chart coming from the ground-based measurements carried out at the observatory there by NOAA. Lots of times you'll see that here. Next shows another carbon-containing molecule in the atmosphere. This is carbon monoxide. This is also mid-troposphere measured with the AIRS instrument, where the Aqua spacecraft. And what you see here is the concentration going in terms of its column amount, and so it's a bigger range. You're going from 0 to 4, with sort of yellows and reds being in the 3 to 4 in the appropriate units. And you see that you've got big signals as you get a smaller background boost. The CO2 well mixed, the gradients were much smaller. So that the main areas where you're getting large amounts in the mid-troposphere, where you've got fires that you get incomplete combustion. So that's where you get the CO and the fires lift things up, and that's where it gets into the mid-troposphere. And sometimes when it gets into the mid-troposphere, you can see that it gets transported over fairly long distances, even so if you can get a plume going from one continent to another. And this thing that you see here, we'll see in some model simulations just how interconnected the atmosphere is, and remind ourselves that we're all breathing the same atmosphere. There's a model simulation for both CO2 and CO. It uses a high-resolution model that represents processes at the surface, processes in the atmosphere, using observations as far as one can, and then having the model transport and transform things. And so that the CO is sort of a shading, and the CO2 uses the colors. And again, we're looking at fairly small variations because it's about 3 or so percent, and the color scheme is such that you can really see some of the strong gradients that you get between the regions where the CO2 is emitted and transported. You can see, again, the plumes that transport their way across. You can see where you've got emissions primarily from fires, and where you're getting the emissions from a lot of industrial activity. So you do see with this type of color scheme, the interhemispheric gradient is clearer, and then the CO is a little bit harder to see, but the CO especially is a product of the incomplete combustion comes from the fire. So we're now at a stage where we're getting to do the models with high enough resolution that we can really look at some of the structures that are there in the atmosphere, and we work hard to try to find ways to relate the observations to the models, so that NASA can use the observations for initializing models to help represent the processes in the models for quantitative evaluation, where we actually have observations to compare with models to do that, and in some cases to produce reanalyses of assimilated data sets. Another model, simulation, high-resolution model, and this shows the atmospheric aerosols, as well as shows where fires are, because fires are responsible for putting particles into the atmosphere and putting trace gases like the carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide that one said. And then you can also get carbon-containing particulates in the atmosphere, primarily from the areas where you've got a lot of burning. But the aerosols are different kinds. So orange is the minimal desert dust that blows off the large deserts. Blue that you'll see more in the southern hemisphere is sea salt. Black represents the sulfate aerosols, that's especially comes from granular coal. And then the green represents black carbon, and organic carbon that comes from areas of biomass burning or other fires, and then you get the sense of the fires where they are here. So other times when we're thinking about the carbon in the atmosphere, we think about the gas phase carbon, CO2, and carbon monoxide, and also methane, but then you've also got particulate carbon, and can have climatic effects as well.
Hello and good morning, and welcome to Mother Channel. My name is Jason Soul, reporting for the ENN Network. It's a beautiful Sunday. Going to cover some stories that came out this week, but there's actually been some really nice summary stories that came out this week. On Friday, I released a video update that was relating to the basic mechanics of climate change. We received a lot of very positive support from that. We also received some negative kind of feedback from people that are clearly deniers of climate change, or rather non-believers in the concept of climate change. I tried my best in the previous update to kind of bring them into a state of reality. So I'm going to address today, first of all, some of the news, and maybe you've heard it or maybe you haven't, but I urge you to check it out for yourself. I'd like to challenge anybody watching this movie, go onto Google and Google extreme weather news, and you will find out for yourself exactly what sort of extreme weather, which always is the frontal kind of shift in a varying climate. But go Google extreme weather, see for yourself what is happening all over the world. The events are simply catastrophic. California is in its longest drought that it's ever had, to the point of where, you know, so far 66 million trees have been reported as dying. You know, these trees, obviously, they become a fire hazard. You've already seen the raging fires that are going on inside of California, and in specific in the Sierra Nevada. In addition to this, there's in Phoenix, an aeroplane couldn't land because the tarmac was actually starting to melt due to extreme temperatures that were being experienced in Sierra Nevada, all across the United States, all across, you know, India, most of Asia, here in Southern Africa. You had temperatures reaching over 50 degrees, 50 degrees and above. This is, you know, almost a continued kind of problem, month in and month out. In Karachi in Pakistan, they're experiencing such water shortages that the intensity of what's going on there is actually forced for the first emergence of what we're going to call climate refugees. These are people that are fleeing a certain area because the climate has shifted so dramatically for so long that they are no longer able to exist in a previously known area of existing, in this case Karachi, Pakistan. They're saying that it's applying massive political pressure, it's applying massive human misery. In Ethiopia, they're back to having one of the longest droughts they've ever had in 50 years. This is also implied in terms of famine. The tornado season is just warming up in the United States, but for the first time China starts experiencing tornadoes. Tornadoes are being experiencing earlier and earlier, almost year on year, every single month, for the last year and a half, a new climate record has been broken almost everywhere in the world. Most of Europe has been experiencing flood after flood after flood. It's becoming like the new normal. And yet you still have people that run around thinking, hey, well, you know, we can be okay like this. We can carry on doing exactly what we do and be okay like this. Well, I got some news for you. I mean, you know, Einstein once said that the moment that bees die off, that within the space of 5 years, most humans will die off too. And I'm not sure of the exact phrasing, was actually something similar to that. And the reason why he said that is because bees are a corner key species, meaning that their pollination ability is it's unbeatable. The bees pollinate more flowers than almost any other living species. With the loss of bees, you lose the pollination. Now, a new report coming out trying to first of all find out why all those bees are dying all over the world, because bees are dying all over the world. But they also seem unable to locate their food source, their pollination source. And it has just been shown that they're failing to find their pollination source simply due to the volume of air pollution that is in the atmosphere. Bees are the tiny micropollutants that are associated with carbon monoxide have had such an extreme reaction to bees that it is confusing them. They're unable to smell where they're going, they're unable to signal to the rest of the hive where to find the pollen, and this is causing a mass dieback in terms of bees. On top of this, then you have the added kind of negative that comes from Monsanto's drive towards nicotine-based kind of fertilizer, nicotine-based pest control, and the impact that it's had on bees. In many countries around the world, it's been made illegal, so you're no longer allowed to use nicotine-based kind of pesticides on crops. But still, the impact that it had on the bees as a species is dramatic and huge. Now, mussels, which is a common kind of food dish that people have from all over the world, it has now just been shown that due to the increasing acidity of the water, due to the increasing temperature of the water, that mussels will likely be off the menu of the world within 85 years. Now, that may seem like a long period of time, but understand, it doesn't, you have mussels, you have mussels, you have mussels every single day up until 85 years, in which case they dramatically fall off. It is a slow deterioration of mussels all around the world until you get to the point that it is no longer commercially viable to actually harvest mussels for the table because it's just too expensive. So I want you to consider something now. If you look at it, you've got all of these extreme kind of events that are happening. But you're not hearing about it on any other channel. I mean, you hear about it on my channel, but you're not hearing about it on any other channel. You hear every now and then, hey, there was a flood there, or hey, there's a raging wildfire there. But the fact is that something is happening. Now, it just happens that it corresponds with an increase in global temperatures. News reports that came out saying that we're no longer able to keep the global temperature between 1.5 to 2 degrees. This is serious news. It's serious. But it was never reported anywhere else. It's basically reported here and to those scientists that actually took the time to go ahead and read it. And so I wondered to myself, why? Like, why? Why is it that it's not covered? Why? What is the problem here? And then I remember a couple of words that my producer doesn't really want me to talk about, but I think I'm going to just use it anyway. And that is that a lot of people seem to think one of three things. First of all, that climate change is somehow a hoax. That climate change was some kind of fraud perpetuated by Al Gore. And third, that climate change is some kind of means of taxing the population. It's a means of further redistributing wealth, your wealth, to the rest of the population. And so, I want to be honest with you, there's only one real fraud or hoax going on here. And that is the fraud that we still believe we can keep polluting. We can keep running around with oil-based and carbon-based kind of fuel sources and keep polluting, and it's going to have zero effect. And if you consider it, when you watch anything, you know, whether it's Al Jazeera or whether it's CNN or anything else for that matter, you're not going to get told that, hey, you know, what you're doing here, this big industry that's worth multi-billions and trillions of dollars, these Saudi princes that drive around merely because they found oil below the ground, do you honestly think they are going to allow national mainstream media to report on the fact that their product, their wealth is derived from the destruction of your environmental future? Do you really think that's going to happen? Of course it's not going to happen. Is that a fraud? I've never in my life heard of a more clear-cut case of fraud. Is it a hoax? It is a hoax for us to believe that we can actually carry on doing this. We cannot carry on doing this. We cannot carry on destroying the planet and thinking there is, absolutely zero effect that is going to happen to us. Because it is definitely going to happen. And if you just start Googling, spend a bit of time actually researching before trolling people that actually have been researching, go out and find out for yourself. Read it up for yourself. We're not making it up here. We are merely reporting on it because nobody else seems capable of doing it. Now, another concept that I've also been thinking about is that a lot of people seem kind of afraid of the idea of what it means to be environmentally sane. And this will address that final point that I made in terms of whether or not it's some kind of wealth redistribution program or some kind of hoax perpetuated by the government to further tax you further. I'm going to give you a picture of what the world could potentially be. Okay? And it's for some of you it's going to be like, oh no, it's a hoax. It's not a hoax. The world is actually not a bad place. People seem to have the concept that somehow, merely because we want things to be done environmentally, that your world is going to change. You've got to go put feathers and shells in your hair, and that everyone's got to go get bongo drums, and they've got to go sit and watch the sun go down while chanting and playing their bongo drums on the beach. And nothing can be further from the truth. What we are referring to here is a variation in the way that business is done. A variation in the way that you are done. You see, my concept for you is very difficult for a lot of very ignorant people to swallow. It's very difficult. And there's a lot of ignorant people out there that would prefer to believe really lame concepts. So I realized quite some time ago, almost 14 years ago, that it was impossible for me to change their minds. Ignorance is bliss in the truest sense of the word. They will run around blissfully denying everything, but the fact of the matter is that they're flawed, they're wrong. And I don't have to change their mind, and neither do you when you talk to them. The reality of what we're trying to do here is about changing the environment around people and not trying to change the person. And what does that mean? It means this. Let's evaluate business based upon the actual result set of that business. Let's take a company. So for argument's sake, I'm going to talk about coal in this instance, which is it's an easy target. So you've got a guy, he's got a coal mine, or he's gone and found a source where coal maybe can be found, okay? And what he does is he will then go and do all these geographic kind of surveys. He will establish the how big the vein is, and he will go and he will develop a business plan. He'll present that business plan to coal mining companies. The coal mining companies will assess that business plan based upon the viability of the extraction of that coal and the distribution of that coal into the marketplace and the wealth that can be accumulated from that. And for years, they can operate with a business model like this. Is it such a bad, crazy shift of idea? Is it so scary that we expect that a company that's primary business is polluting our atmosphere to have some kind of impact for polluting the atmosphere, for correcting the atmosphere? And as I said to somebody this morning, I said, you know what? It's not about another rubbish tax, that the government's just going to tax you and they're going to take money from these companies and nothing ever happens from it. The government will just put that tax money into their coffers and they'll sit back and give each other raises and have a nice day. It cannot be in that model. It has to be in a model in which the actual result sets of that company, the funds that come from that company, are driven directly towards cleaning up their product. Is that such a bad thing, that a company is actually responsible for the byproduct of their product? Is it such a bad thing that a company evaluates the viability of a business based on the ability to destroy the environment for not only them, but the entire world population around them? Is that so bad? Is it so difficult to do? Take a look at electricity. A lot of people they spoke about things, oh no, the whole green movement is really just about taxing us further so that they can build up these power stations and these renewable stations and increase the cost of our electricity to offset the money that they've spent on renewable energy. And in a way, they are 100% right. They are 100% right. Most countries, including my own country, are going to do that. They are going to build up these massive solar plants and they're going to keep billing people. You will keep paying. There will be no direct benefit, implied or inferred benefit that is given to you. Can you pause quick? Okay, so my apologies, we were interrupted. I was talking about electricity. A lot of people seem to suspect that what will happen is the government, after making people pay extra for their electricity, for putting up these big, beautiful, either wind farms or concentrated solar farms, or solar, just general photovoltaic solar farms, that the government will keep charging them and increase their taxation merely due to the government's kind of role in wanting to be green and wanting to offset emissions. Now, albeit that the government needs to offset their emissions, and albeit that it is part of their role towards controlling emissions, so moving from a coal-fired power source into a renewable source, this is all really good and well. But it is dangerous for the people that are already struggling with high power bills. So what is the fix to this? Well, we've already seen the fix to this, and there's no reason why this fix shouldn't be done everywhere in the world. Here in South Africa, that we have exactly the same problem, okay? Our government wants to put up solar farms. In fact, our government has put up solar farms. And yes, they bought those solar farms from big, European countries for a far greater rate than what is probably required. And yes, even though we have these giant solar farms or big solar farms, no benefit or direct for the actual consumer of that power is received in any way. In fact, if anything, the price of our power has increased, and this is a fear that is happening all around the world. Again, back here in South Africa, our government then takes a look at its means of resolving this, and so what they do is they propose some trillion rand, and it's a rand for us, but trillion rand nuclear plants, which is actually insane. First of all, nuclear just takes forever to erect. It takes forever. There is never yet. In fact, I will be challenged. I challenge you to find me a single example of a single nuclear plant that is A, being delivered on time, and B, being delivered on cost, which means that the actual implied cost of what they're being offered is never realized at the end of the project. So, that's pretty much it for nuclear. If you consider how long it takes to put up nuclear, if you consider the amount of effort and energy that goes into just mining the uranium for nuclear, and then basically utilize that nuclear in terms of generating energy, and then the disposal of that kind of nuclear waste. I mean, it's a crazy concept. We're splitting an atom to boil water. That's essentially what we're doing. We're flash boiling water, and we're basically driving turbines. But to come back to my point, the problem here has nothing to do with what the government does. The problem has to do with us. The government is under the illusion that they somehow own our grid, where nothing can be further from the truth. The grid belongs to the people. It does not belong to the government. All the infrastructure, installations, coal-fired plants, nuclear-fired plants, any means of generating electricity does not belong to the government. They are merely a short-term custodian of that facility. So the reality is that should the government then say, listen, I tell you what, instead of us continuing to build these ridiculously overpriced kind of nuclear plants, these ridiculously overpriced coal plants, what we're going to do is we're going to roll out renewable energy. And sure, renewable energy, if you go wind turbines, it requires a certain geographic location. There has to be wind. If you're putting up solar farms, obviously, it's got to be an area that's got a good solar energy density. But the reality is, and here's the trick is to ensure that the population receives the benefit of the free power. The government is no longer, once the farm is built and once it's maybe 2 years, 3 years, recovered the cost of that farm, the government should give the power to the people. It should. It should, because it's not costing them anything. They maybe have to run around every now and then and do a little cleanup. The power, the benefit of free energy needs to be given to the people, and it has been given to the people in some countries. In Chile, in Portugal, in Germany. In fact, in Germany, they make so much power, they actually had to pay people to utilize power. So the reality is that it's very much a viable concept. First assess business based on their direct impacts, then join a network of people and force the government to give us what is rightfully ours. If we put up solar and the power is free, Give us our free power. And you see, the problem that government has, and I understand this as a problem, is that they make a lot of money from generating electricity for the grid. They make a lot of money. And in their minds, they fear the fact that by giving up that money, that they somehow are operating to the detriment of all the people that they've got employed. But the reality of what they're missing here is that companies and consumers that have had the benefit of that not paying that electricity in their pocket ultimately spend that same money within that economy, which means that there is additional taxation, first of all, on the spend. There is a greater opportunity for entrepreneurship for people that are selling services into the economy, and there's more wealth. Companies that are already struggling, people that are struggling, they can't afford electricity, are all of a sudden given the opportunity to have free electricity. And is this a hard concept? Is this a dangerous concept? Is this something that we need to be afraid of? I don't think so. If you take a look at food now, for argument's sake, so let's look at food. At the moment, you've got a whole lot of subsidized farms. And I'm not going to go into the whole political rubbish in relation to farmers' subsidies, etc. What I'm talking about is the viability of a farm. Now, let's say that I'm able to grow something, and I'm able to use very little water, but I have to use a hell of a lot of chemicals in order to make that thing grow. And I do that. Or I've genetically engineered this kind of seed to make that thing grow. And then the thing grows, okay? And then that food that gets harvested from that gets put on your table, and it gets put on your table at a cheap cost, okay? But the chemicals that they used in order to achieve that growth, they get washed away into the water system, where some of them never, ever biodegrade. And for argument's sake, most are like a huge water aquifers that become absolutely polluted, and to the point that you're no longer able to drink it. So even though you're sitting there buying your cheap product, your cheap piece of veggie, your big oversized kind of cabbage, whatever gets your thing going, the reality is that the cost of the production of that is damaging to the environment for everybody. For everybody. And now, so I could understand, look, if there's no other way, we've got to feed like 7 billion or 7.4 billion people. There's no other way, but there is. And the alternative to that is not advanced, it's not complex, it's extremely simple, and not only is it beneficial for people's health, but it actually is beneficial for absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's a simple organic principle of farming. Why is it that it's so easy for somebody that's going to grow with Monsanto, or somebody that's going to, destroy a huge segment of the desert with and putting crops there where crops shouldn't be, and draw water from an aquifer where it shouldn't be drawn, and use chemicals to keep it alive against pests? Why is it that he's easily able to obtain financing, easily able to get his product to market, yet somebody who is actually doing something beneficial, A, for the environment, B, for your health, because there's more nutrients inside of vegetables that are derived from an organic process, there's more benefit in terms of carbon sequestration from the atmosphere by keeping the microbes in the soil, there's more benefit from not having chemicals flushed away into our water system, ultimately ending up in the sea. There is only benefit. Why is it such a hard concept? Do you have to go put a shell in your hair? Do you have to go beat drums on the beach? No. You just merely have to do something that you're doing anyway, but just from a healthy perspective. Healthy not just for you, but healthy for the environment. Why is it that we keep thinking we can't have these things in a green economy? Why? It's madness. Then take a look at meat, for argument's sake. Okay, so we know something about meat. Okay, meat is delicious for those people that love meat. Okay, there's a lot of people that don't like meat. I personally like meat. But the fact is, do I have to stop eating meat now?